There's a historic tendency, as the language of conservatism and liberalism is bandied about or tossed to and fro like a frisbee, to interpret these terms in simplistic, popular ways. My recently published book, Scrutinizing Scruton, Canadian High Toryism and Scrutonia, is a reflection on particularly Roger Scruton. Roger Scruton is considered one of the most significant, and he is in many ways, conservative intellectuals of the present age. He died a couple of years ago, just as COVID was coming our way. But my book deals with how the language of conservatism and the language of high Toryism and the language of libertarianism often gets mixed up. So, for example, today in Canada, we have a head of the Conservative Party who's not conservative in any minimal sense. He's a libertarian. And then we have people who see themselves as conservatives, and they often confuse Toryism with conservatism. Now, in North America, the tendency is to think Canadian political thought is much the same as American political thought. So in the United States, if you're Republican, you're some version of conservatism. If you're Democrat, you're some version of liberalism. And of course, there's variations and there's a spectrum in that itself. But conservatism within the United States tends to, given the foundations of the United States, which was the Puritans coming across the water, reacting to both what they saw as a state they could not trust and a church they could not trust. What was the priorities for them was liberty, liberty of religion, freedom of worship, and often freedom from the state, freedom of the marketplace. And this was a Puritan ideology that became secularized in time. So the principles are much the same as liberty or freedom, individuality, equality, agency, choice. And there's a variety of almost catechisms of liberalism. And so when we think of the origins of liberalism that come out of the Protestant Reformation, most people see liberalism as emerging in the 17th, 18th century with the Glorious Revolution in England or what was happening in France or other places. But in fact, the very principles of liberalism, as I mentioned, is freedom, liberty, liberty from, but liberty for what? So freedom from what, but freedom for what? Negative and positive liberty. These become key elements of the Protestant Reformation itself. And these were the principles that were foundational to the founding of the United States in a way that is not the same in Canada. Canada maintained a deeper connection with an older version of the connection between individuality and the common good, the role of the state and society in tension. And this is part of an older high Tory tradition that Canada inherited from its English, but also the classical tradition itself, coming through Greek or Roman thought, up through the English tradition, and then Canada. So Canada never weaned itself in quite the same way from that classical European tradition in the way the United States is. So when we hear the word conservatism today, often what is being conserved is that 16th, 17th century notion of freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom from the state, freedom for guns, freedom for the marketplace, a lack of state involvement, and upholding of society, or what's called the social principle, and a certain suspicion of the state, other than, of course, for militarism or policing, because the two ways a person can lose their liberty is invasion from without or crime from within, hence the large prisons in the United States. And so when we think of the language of then conservatism today, what it is conserving is 16th century and 17th century notions of liberty of religion, freedom from the state, freedom for the marketplace, usually freedom from taxes, freedom for guns. So this is this language of liberty, liberty, liberty. Now, as a result of what happened in this particular understanding of the content of liberty, what you get is inevitably a class society develops between those who are freer, who are more wealthier, and those who do not have as much. So what happens is then social liberalism comes along and says a stronger state is needed, higher taxes are needed, so goods can be distributed more equitably. So a healthcare system can be affordable to one and all, because not all have the same origins in that sense. And so the language of liberalism today takes a variety of directions, but one is that it's called social liberalism or welfare liberalism, which conservatives see as an infraction on their freedom, on their liberties. And so someone like then Roger Scruton, who plays a very important role in not only English but American conservatism, he's almost a guru for many in the Anglo-American context. He harkens back to what he sees as the political correctness of liberalism, welfare liberalism, statist liberalism, which interferes with increasingly so the liberty of the individual, the freedom to live one's own life as we see fit without interference from the state on a whole range of ethical and social and economic and tax issues. And so when we hear conservatism today, we always have to ask ourselves, what is being conserved? And someone like Roger Scruton is attempting to conserve these 16th, 17th century principles against which he sees as new leftist progressivism, what he sees as welfare liberalism, statist liberalism, which threatens the primary importance of the individual and their liberty, and society's grassroots up organizing their life as they see fit rather than state-down projects and organizations and bureaucracies and administration. So you get this split then in someone like a Roger Scruton to some degree, and you find it in that Anglo-American form of conservatism of which state versus society is the problem, and freedom is best understood in community, in grassroots up, versus state interfering and taxing people in that way. So it's this either or tendency. And then Scruton, of course, he sees the new left as the problem. He sees someone like an Edward Said as the problem. His works against the left, he slips into very quickly right and left categories, and he in his works in terms of critiquing the left or the new left, he very much is a dualist, and this is often something to be very worrisome and wary of also in this discussion of left, right, liberal, conservative. Is one absolutely right and the other absolutely wrong? Well, obviously that's not the case. Forms of conservatism, there's insight, but there's Achilles' heel. Forms of political correctness, culture wars, there's insights in that, but there's often blind spots there. Now, someone like a George Grant, because my book is on scrutinizing Scruton, so I scrutinize his understanding of conservatism and ask, is it just not an early version of liberalism itself, which of course it is, because liberalism goes through various phases as it changes chameleon form with content. Now, Canadian high Toryism, and here I look at key Canadian thinkers like George Grant, who is probably one of the more prominent public Canadian intellectuals of the second half of the 20th century. I look at Stephen Leacock. And in these people, you do not get the clash between state versus society, individual versus community. One is right, the other is wrong, sort of a dualism. They recognize that there's an important role for both state and society to work together for the common good. Stephen Leacock, for example, taught political science most of his life at McGill University. The leftist party in Canada, which became the New Democratic Party, it was the CCF earlier, many of the founders of the CCF were Leacock students at McGill. And so here you have someone like a high Tory, Stephen Leacock, going out of his way to support people who are key figures in the left. Now, one would often not think a conservative in our some more popular understanding of that would support people on the left. But in Canadian high Toryism, there's affinities between the left and Toryism. That is the organic nature of history, the organic nature of society, the responsibilities of one and all to support one another through the use of the state and society. So there's a dynamic that exists that doesn't slip into either orism, state versus society, left versus right. So someone like a Stephen Leacock is going to argue very clearly that be wary of slipping into these dualisms. In the Canadian literary tradition, I look at key figures like Milton Acorn, who's considered one of the great Canadian high Tory poets. He publishes his work on the Red and Green Pony, a fine little work that comes out. He essentially wins the Governor General's Award in Literature for that, in which he threads together red and green, and this is a Tory. Most people think if you're interested in green ecology, you must be often some variation of the center-left. Why is that the case? Toryism, of course, are deeply grounded in ecological, environmental issues for the simple reason that we live in a natural world, and our relationship to nature will have an impact on ourselves and nature. And so here you have a key Canadian poet. High Tory understands the relationship between red, green, and blue for that matter. So it's a synthesis. Another great Canadian poet, Maria Fiamingo, much the same in that sense. And so my book, the Scrutinizing Scruton, Canadian High Toryism in Scrutonia, attempts to deconstruct a certain understanding, first of all, of conservatism, highlighting that it is in fact a form of liberalism, and secondly, there is a form of a much older conservatism, which I call high Toryism, which is not as much either or, right and wrong, black and white, but understands the dynamic tensions between state, society, the individual and community, the past and the present and the future. Edmund Burke, even though he's often seen as a conservative, he was a Rockingham Whig, but one of the things he said that true democracy is the voice of the past, the present, and the future. So how do we make sense of what we have heard from the past, what it calls us forth to hear, the relationship of the present and our responsibility as we move into the future. But in Canada, certainly the two political philosophers, and philosophers per se, and theologians who understood this very well and wisely, which I focus on a little more, is Stephen Leacock and George Grant. They were probably the two most prominent public intellectuals in Canada in the 20th century. And then back of them in the 19th century, the founding of Canada, our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. Again, you have the strong federal government and the role of a strong government. This is not socialism. This is not communism. It's an understanding of the role of the state as an agent of bringing in the good with society. So my book, Scrutinizing Scruton, I scrutinize, or I deconstruct in that sense, Scruton for those who particularly genuflect to Scruton in opposition to what they see as liberalism and the problems of liberalism as an ideological construct itself, and the culture wars in which variations of liberalism cancel out conservatives, the badmouth conservatives. And there needs to be a higher discussion at the level of politics and political philosophy that transcends this tribalism of conservative and liberal. So one of the challenges definitely before people of faith as they move into the future, it's one thing to grapple with philosophical issues, biblical issues, church tradition issues, exegetical issues, but what does this all have to do when engaging the public realm philosophically at the level of political philosophy? Because if this is not engaged in the level of political philosophy, all of these interesting discussions of faith can be just a form of Gnosticism in the Folklinian sense, as we're talking about ideas outside of time and history, when in fact we are dealing with serious economic, ecological issues, social issues in time and history. And if we don't grapple with these issues, one sense we're separating ideals that float above time and history from the hard issues that have to be grappled with in time and history. Sadly so, that discussion often takes place in a very limited framework between conservative and liberal. It's a bit like if Jesus was confronted with, are you a Pharisee or are you a Sadducee? You've got to be one or the other. Well, why do you have to be one or the other? Why does one have to be a conservative or a liberal? Are there no other ways of thinking outside that very narrow construct? Or are you an Essene or are you a Zealot? Well, none of the above. Are you Herodian? Are you a Samaritan? No, why do I? So why does the issue of political philosophy have to be reduced to an either or, a conservative or a liberal? Surely the time has come in which we transcend that trendy dualism and think beyond that. And I think the high Tory tradition is a way of doing that, certainly within the Anglo-Canadian context, but that tradition offers a way of thinking that transcends the Canadian context as well. And such is the heart of my book on scrutinizing, Scruton, Canadian high Toryism, and Scrutonia.